Good evening to each and every one of you. We want to welcome you to the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Washington, D.C. We're so thankful to be in partnership with the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and we have participated in this distinguished lecture series over the years, and it is an extraordinary feast for the mind and for the spirit. I want to remind you of the significance of this holy place, the oldest continuously held parcel of property by persons of African descent in the capital, that this was the host site for the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, and many of the luminaries for freedom and justice and many great artists would meet here on Tuesdays to encourage people's spirits, especially when they were fainting. So Leontine Price and Maddie Wilda Dobbs and William Edward Burghardt Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Mary McLeod Bethune, the Grimkeys, Eleanor Roosevelt. The list goes on and on of human beings who valued human beings and who wanted to make this nation what it claims to be. And so that is our work, to expand head and heart for the tasks that are before us. We welcome you to this place called Metropolitan, and we look forward to serving those of you in the digital space and those of you who are here in the sanctuary, serving you with the kind of hospitality that is unique to our community of faith. Thank you and good evening, and allow me to present to you Theo Brown, who is the Captain Kirk of this Starship Enterprise. Oh, Sarah first, I'm sorry. Sarah, who is the Captain Kirk of New York Avenue Presbyterian.
Hardly. No, Bill, you got it exactly right. Theo is the Captain Kirk of our McClendon Scholar Program, and I'll say a word of gratitude at the end in just a minute to Theo for all of the planning, and to our McClendon Scholar Board who, along with Metropolitan, have made tonight possible. But first, thank you to Reverend Lamar, to Metropolitan for hosting us, for your long partnership in ministry and also in the McClendon Scholar Program. It's nice to see several familiar faces from our programs of past, and so if you have participated in one of those, you may know a little bit about the history of the McClendon Scholar Program at New York Avenue. But for those for whom this may be the first time engaging in the Scholar Series and engaging both with the speakers that we have, but also with the partnership with Metropolitan and New York Avenue, let me just say a word about how we got here. The McClendon Scholar Program is part of the legacy of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church Associate Pastor, the late Reverend Dr. Jack McClendon. And it's committed to placing the works of authors and scholars in conversation with what it means to be a person of faith. That is, to be God's person in the world. And Jack wisely believed that both the Academy and the body of Christ are both encouraged and sharpened for our witness and for our work when we find ourselves in joyful and rigorous conversation. Tonight's presentation and McClendon Scholar event by Tiya Miles is a wonderful opportunity to step into that legacy in continued ways and to engage in that conversation. What a privilege to have Professor Miles with us. In her book, Night Flyer, she invites us on a journey of humanizing and complicating the rich faith and worldview of the woman that history knows as Harriet Tubman. With grace and insight, Dr. Miles navigates the fine line of uncovering for us fresh perspectives in Harriet's story, while carefully preserving the freedom and dignity of allowing Harriet Tubman to tell her story in her own words, something that she prized above all else. Through Harriet's faith, Dr. Miles also draws us into conversation with eco-womanism, with critical reflection and contemplation on environmental justice from the perspectives of women of African descent, including their activist methods, their religious practices, and their insights on how to engage earth justice, a topic that is deeply relevant for our day and time. As I listened to Professor Miles' book, she grabbed my attention and my sacred imagination with her first words. The storm was coming. I thought with each page about the storms that have crested throughout our history and the storms that are cresting and already falling on the horizons of our world today. And I was left wondering, as I turned, or in my case, listened to the last page, with the question that her book, I think, poses. How do we, like Harriet, pay attention to those storms while also cultivating an alternative consciousness, one that is committed to the liberation of all creation and is sustained by the unending faithfulness of God? I am so grateful to Professor Miles for her insights, and I cannot wait to hear from her tonight and also for her conversation with Reverend Lamar. Let me indeed turn things back over to Captain Kirk. I'm really grateful to Theo Brown as well. Theo is part of the group that made tonight's possible. Theo is the director of our McClendon Scholar Program at the church, and alongside board members, he makes programs like tonight possible, all the ways and the details from welcoming you when you came in the door to what it means to host Professor Miles and get you safely to the airport along with Metropolitan. So Theo, thank you for all your efforts and also for your leadership, so come on.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to add my welcome and say also what a pleasure it is to work with Metropolitan AME in hosting this event. As Sarah indicated, during the past 10 years, our congregation has worked closely with Metropolitan AME in a variety of ways, and it's always a joy to do so. We have co-sponsored and organized several McClendon Scholar programs through the years. We've done community organizing together through the Washington Interfaith Network, and we work together to establish and manage the Returning Citizens Assistance Network that now has 20 congregations that help residents of the district who are currently or formerly incarcerated. We look forward to continuing this kind of cooperation and indeed hope to even do more in the future. We're delighted you've chosen to spend time with us tonight. We had over 1,000 people register for this program. Now, most of you who signed up are watching and joining us online, and we have people from more than 20 states around the union joining us in this webinar, and they'll be with us this evening. If you're online, we invite you to take a moment and go to the chat function and sort of sign in and tell us your name, where you are, if you're with a particular congregation or organization, maybe mention that too. It's always very interesting and also quite helpful to see where folks are tuning in from around the country. We also have a good crowd that has come here in Washington on this chilly night, and we're delighted you made the extra effort to be here. I hope you have met some of the folks who are near you. Later on, we are going to have a reception afterwards, so you'll have an opportunity to chat with that person you just got to say hi to or who sat down the row from you and you haven't had a chance to meet yet. And again, thank you for making the special effort to be here. I want to thank a few people as we get into the program. I want to thank my friend Michael Potter, who originally told me about Dr. Miles' book and suggested we have a program with her. I also want to acknowledge the members of the McClendon Scholar Council that Sarah mentioned earlier, members of New York Avenue who help us plan and manage these programs. Many of them have been helping tonight with registration and other things. I want to thank the folks at Metropolitan who've helped, particularly Reverend Cosette Thomas, Reverend Bruce Herbert, who've been a part of planning and all aspects of getting the program together tonight. Now, in terms of our program agenda and flow tonight, it's quite simple. We're going to have an opening presentation from Dr. Tiya Miles, and then a long conversation between Dr. Miles and Reverend Lamar. Reverend Lamar will ask some questions that are on his mind but he also has some that have been submitted in advance by some of you who are here and others who may be watching online. Some members of New York Avenue and some members of Metropolitan agreed to read the book in advance and send in some questions of what their reaction was to having read Night Flyer, and Reverend Lamar will be sharing some of those and as he has his conversation with Dr. Miles. After their conversation, we'll take just a moment to share some information about how you can continue your learning and build on what you've heard tonight, and we'll also tell you a bit about the next McClendon Scholar Program. And then, as I mentioned, after the program, there will be a reception in Frederick Douglass Hall, where you registered earlier this evening. Most of you, when you came in, you can get there, and we'll mention that again at the close of the time as we adjourn to that. For those of you online, we'll say the Q&A function will stay open throughout the program. We invite you to write in questions that you have for Dr. Miles if you've read her book or based on the presentation. Now, we won't have time to read them out in this program, but we will collect all of them, and we'll be sharing them with Dr. Miles, and I know she'll be interested to see the questions you have based on her presentation. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tiya Miles to you. Tiya Miles was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. She holds an AB in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University, an MA in Women's Studies from Emory University, and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. She taught on the faculty of the University of Michigan for 16 years, where she served as chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and director of the Native American Studies program. Dr. Miles is currently the Michael Garvey Professor of History and Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. I hope they don't have to say all of that when they answer the phone. She is well known as both a public historian and an academic historian, and that can be a rare feat, somebody who does history both for the general public and for fellow academics. She works primarily in the intersection of African American, Native American, and women's histories in the context of place. And during the past few years, she has become increasingly focused on ecological questions, environmental storytelling, and ways of articulating and enlivening Black environmental consciousness. Dr. Miles is the author of 7 books and the only current 2-time winner of Yale's Frederick Douglass Prize for the study of slavery, abolition, and resistance. All that she carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, which some have read and love. What a wonderful book it is. In fact, was rewarded with the National Book Award for nonfiction. It was a New York Times bestseller and selected as one of the 10 best books of the year by the Washington Post and many, many other publications. In addition to her writing and teaching, Dr. Miles has served as a consultant for the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Idle-Young Museum in Indianapolis, and the Chief Van House State Historic Site in Georgia. She is a recipient of both a Guggenheim Fellowship and a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award Fellowship. In addition to all of this, she is married and the mother of 3 children, including twin girls. As you can tell, Dr. Miles has a very full and rich life, and we're delighted to have her with us this evening as a McClendon Scholar. Please join me in welcoming Tiya Miles.
There we go. Thank you. Let me turn on there. Thank you. All right. Can you all hear me? All right. Let's try again. Can you all hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Victor. I think there was an adjustment that happened up there. Well, I am very pleased and honored to be with you this evening. I am so happy that those of you who are here in the sanctuary have chosen to bundle up and come out to talk about Harriet Tubman this evening. And I'm also very glad that those of you who are with us in the digital space are here participating in our conversation. So I have been told by Captain Kirk that I have approximately 15 minutes or so to offer an overview before we move into a dialogue with Reverend Lamar. This is going to be a little bit challenging, but I'm going to do my best to stay within that time frame. I've been looking forward to coming here and to being with you because these are very chaotic times, destabilizing times, and I find it reassuring to be in good company. I thank you for being among that good company, and I look forward to exchanging and sharing in fellowship together. So let me tell you what I intended with my book, Night Flyer, Harriet Tubman and the Faith Dreams of a Free People. You actually got a hint of this earlier when you heard my introduction. I intended to write a book that was focused on the environment, that was focused on environmental history, and the ways in which Harriet Tubman would have had to read the natural world, read the landscape, navigate the wilderness to free herself and to free dozens of other people. That was the plan, and it seems like a wise plan. It was several years ago when a colleague of mine who is an environmental studies scholar and who knew I was working on slavery and black women told me that I should take a closer look at Harriet Tubman. She said, Harriet Tubman was an environmentalist. She had to read the moss to get to where she was going. So I tucked this information away way back in around 2005, carried it with me, thought about it, collected material, and the time finally came for me to write a book about Tubman. I was very excited to get into that environmental research. And then I went back to the primary sources about Harriet Tubman. And these mostly consist of as told to biographies that people who Tubman knew wrote. They talked with her, they interviewed her, and they wrote her story down because as an enslaved girl and young woman, she was never permitted, she was not allowed to learn how to read and to write. So Tubman would tell her story to people, they would write it down, and we have, as close as we can get to Harriet Tubman's voice, we have a facsimile of the kinds of things that she said and the ways in which she thought. So I went back to these materials, looking for the environment, and I did see a lot of trees, but what I saw more than anything else was Harriet Tubman's deep faith. And in fact, her faith, her trust in the God of her belief appeared in the record long before she ever became Harriet Tubman. When she was a very small child, just a little tiny girl, shorter than down here below in this podium, she was known by the nickname Minty and went by the full name Araminta Ross. As a small child around the age of 4, 5, 6, Minty Ross was rented out, leased out, loaned out by the man who owned her and her mother and her 8 siblings. And during these periods when she was leased out and sent far away from her parents and her family, when she was a very small girl, Minty Ross prayed. These are memories that she shared with the people who talked with her and wrote her story down. She recalled that second home that she was sent to as a forced child laborer and how terrified she was to be in this big house with white people. She'd never been so close to white people before. how afraid she was to come up to where they were and to even get a glass of milk that they offered her. And how instead of taking milk from these people who terrified her, even though she was thirsty, even though she never had treats like sweet milk, she would go off into another part of the house and sort of hide herself and shelter herself in the architecture of the home, and she would pray. A small child who would be the age of a kindergartner or a first grader now was praying. Going back to these primary sources, I saw that again and again, that Harriet Tubman or Araminta Ross was always seeking out God. And then I thought, this is supposed to be an environmental book. So what am I going to do with the fact that what I see all over these pages is faith, is spirituality, is God? To try to solve the puzzle of what the book should be, I looked to people who were like Harriet Tubman. That is, other black girls who became black women, who turned into champions for freedom. I identified a handful of individuals who started off enslaved like Tubman or started off indentured, so also were not free, who pushed against the confines of societal expectations, and who answered a call to preach because they felt that this is what God intended for them. So I learned through that additional research, through sort of looking out beyond Tubman, by seeing her as a cohort, that she was not alone in the strength of her faith. She was not alone in many of the courageous things she did. And also, nature was a part of the story. So it came back around. It came back around full circle, so that I was able to see, by the time that I was writing the book, that Harriet Tubman had a ferocious faith from the time that she was a small child to the time that she was an old woman, and until her death in 1913. And that spirituality was interlaced with her understanding and with her sense of the natural world. The two were joined in her experience, and the two were also joined in the experiences of the other women whose lives I looked to, who were preaching in the early and mid-19th century. So Night Flyer became the book that is very much about faith. It's very much about what had to take shape in order for Araminta Ross to become the person we now know as Harriet Tubman. And what I found and what I try to show in the book is what happened, the core ingredients of Harriet Tubman's character were her passionate belief in God, her view that she was never alone, no matter what was taking place around her, because God was always with her, her trust in nature to be with her and to support her in companionship or in partnership with God, and also her ability to recognize what it was that her parents were doing and to see them as models in her own life. So faith, spiritual belief, an understanding of the natural world and how it connected with her view of God's presence and God's help, and also a deep, deep tie to family are the factors that shaped Araminta Ross into Harriet Tubman, the freedom fighter. This book ended up becoming a very spiritual. The word that came to mind that I paused to avoid was prophetic. That doesn't feel right, actually, but I'm just telling you what happened in my mind. The book ended up becoming very spiritual, and I have always said that that happened because that's what I saw when I went to the primary sources. That's what I saw when I read those early accounts of Harriet Tubman's life, when I read quotations by Harriet Tubman, written down by other people. And I'll share a few of those in a moment. But a friend of mine who is the Associate Dean for Divinity at the university where I work and who is herself a minister, she heard me say this once. She heard me say, oh, it's about prayer, it's about God, it's about the power of spirituality, because that's what I saw in the sources. And she said, Tiya, it ended up being about those themes because you listened and you obeyed. I thought, wow, that's some straight talk maybe. I'm not quite sure how to take this. But I am appreciative of whatever it was that came together to make this book into what it was, into what it has become, rather, because I do feel now that this is a book that is speaking indirectly, or maybe even directly, to our times. And I think that was the notion that was coming to mind when I heard the word prophetic in my head and edited it in my head. It's not about the typing that I did or the research that went into the book. It's about instead something else behind the book or coming through the book that has made it feel like it's speaking to our moment. I don't know what that something is. If my friend were here, I'm sure she would have a word to say. She would tell you what she thinks that something is. I don't know what it is, but I am grateful for it. I am grateful for whatever this message is that Harriet Tubman is allowing me to share with you and to bring into our conversation right now. So what I'd like to do before I offer you a few quotation highlights and a few takeaways is to read passages from the beginning of the book. And these are passages that found their way into the book after I had written it and realized that it was actually about faith. They're at the beginning, and they're just standalone verses, really, or lines of text to frame the book. I titled these Provocation, Grasping the Past in the Present. The first provocation comes from the author Cole Arthur Riley, who has the Instagram page or feed called Black Liturgies. You may be aware of it, and if you're not yet, you will want to go to Instagram and look for Black Liturgies. She has beautiful, beautiful verse there. So this is from her work. Let us grasp the staffs of our past, believing in their power even now, that we would be a people who meet desperation and sorrow with a remembrance that protects us from despair. When I read that, I thought, that is the project of this book. That this book and bringing Harriet Tubman to mind, and remembering Harriet Tubman, can really be a staff for us that we can hold on to. It can become like a physical thing, like a material thing that can help us to orient so that we don't have to live in despair and sorrow. But instead we can remember our power when we recall our ancestors. And when I say our ancestors, I don't just mean blood kin. I also mean our cultural ancestors and our spiritual ancestors. I truly believe that Harriet Tubman and those like her, those brave people from the past, belong to all of us. They are all of our ancestors, and we can remember them as a form of protection in the present time. So another passage from the beginning of the book is one that I wrote, and it just came to me, and I wanted to have it frame the pages that follow. Ours is the time of the seventh trouble, but we do not wait in these woods alone. Harriet walked this way before, showing us how the wilderness works. She could have leaned against that tree. She would have pointed out that star. She could have sketched a map in the dirt and bid us memorize it. Then she might have whispered a secret that the trees already knew. We can be a flock alighting. If we join hands, we will fly. In this passage, I make reference to the seventh trouble. And that's because in the materials that we have about Harriet Tubman, she says something again and again. There's a refrain in stories we have about her in which she talks about the sixth trouble, and how God helped her through the sixth trouble. God helped her 6 times. And since he did it 6 times, and since he was there for the sixth trouble, he will be there for the seventh trouble, and she could count on it. So this was a refrain in her prayers. She would pray about this, the seventh trouble. It's the seventh trouble. God has been here 6 times before. She always knows and trusts and believes that God will be there. And so in this passage, I was trying to call that notion to mind of the seventh trouble. Now, I wrote this, was it a year and a half ago now? I didn't write it in our present moment, but I do think that there's something about this seventh trouble that would accurately describe what we are experiencing today. Tubman believed that God would appear for the seventh trouble, and that brings me hope. It is like a staff of our past that I hold on to. So a few highlights of Harriet Tubman's words to share with you. We don't have many of these, and the ones that we have are quite precious. This is a quote that Harriet Tubman is said to have shared with one of her biographers in her own time, so people who knew her and talked with her. And this is one of the examples that I look to talk about how Tubman was so close to family and followed the model of family, and was also very aware of the natural world. Tubman said, quote, "In the eastern shore of Maryland, Dorchester County is where I was born. The first thing I remember was lying in the cradle. You seen these trees that are hollow? Take a big tree, cut it down, put a board in each end, make a cradle of it, and call it a gum. I remember lying in that there." So this quotation is special, in part because it's Harriet Tubman's earliest memory. I mean, how precious that we have her words, thinking back to her childhood. It's also special because she knows the species of tree that that cradle was made of. She knows that it was from the gum tree. And what she doesn't say, but what we know, is that her enslaved father, Ben Ross, who couldn't live with his family because he was owned by a different owner than her mother, was a timberman and a skilled carpenter. He was somebody who worked with wood and taught Tubman those skills. So Ben Ross is likely the person who carved this cradle that Tubman remembers. Don't ever let anybody tell you that slavery destroyed families. Families maintained their love and they maintained their strength. And we see that in this quotation with Tubman remembering her father. One of the most incredible things in Tubman's story, and there are so many, so many, is that as she grew older and as she became a teenager, she worked quite a lot outside. This is partly because she hated domestic work. She hated being under the nose and under the thumb of mistresses who rented her and who abused her. And so she refused to learn how to weave. At that point, early people who were renting her and leasing her put her outside and made her do all kinds of dangerous, treacherous work that sickened her and depleted her body from the very small size and a very young age. One of Tubman's biographers said about her, quote, "Out-of-door drudgery was put upon her, the labor of the horse and the ox. the lifting of barrels of flour, and other heavy weights. So this was a burden that was unfit for any child, for any young girl, for any person in her time. And yet Tubman was doing it as a teenager. It turns out, though, that this outdoor work placed her in the company of her father, Ben Ross, the skilled timberman. He had by this time been able to obtain his freedom, and Araminta Ross, his teenage daughter, managed to wheel and deal and negotiate and work her way into a situation where she was working under her father. He was leading a group of people who were enslaved and free, working in the timber yard of a slave owner in the area, and Araminta Ross was the only female in their company. She was doing heavy, heavy labor. And she was also learning from her father. She was learning about the woods, learning about the wilderness, learning about what plants grow that are edible, where are the waterways, which way do they flow, how do you read the sky, how do you know which star is the North Star? And Tubman later said about this period of intense, heavy labor, quote, "I was getting fitted for the work the Lord was getting ready for me." Another precious quote that we have from Harriet Tubman, where she tells us that even though this was a time of great trial, even though she suffered physically from the labor and many other things that perhaps Reverend Lamar and I will discuss, she could look back in retrospect and see that the time when she was outside working in those woods under the tutelage of her father, that she was getting fitted and she was getting ready because God was with her. Later in her life, she used all these skills and all this knowledge to help free dozens of people, approximately 70 people, from enslavement in Maryland, and then to help free over 700 people from enslavement in South Carolina. There's so much more that I would love to say, but I'm going to hold back and just end with a poem that appears at the end of Night Flyer. This poem comes from the poet Korash Ali Lansana, and it's in his book, They Shall Run, Harriet Tubman Poems. It is titled Incantation. The Lord has been with me in 6 troubles. He will not desert me in the 7th. He will not desert me in the 7th. The Lord has been with me in 6. He will not in the 7th. In 6 troubles, the Lord will not desert me. Lord, in the 7th, the Lord will not desert. Thank you.
Would you join me in thanking Professor Miles again for sharing with us? Professor Miles, I have you come down and join me. I'll bring your microphone. Thank you very much. You got it? All right, and I'll bring the microphone. You take the, oh, you got it? Okay, good. Again, we want to thank you for joining us, and we are in quite a moment, and you shared some, but I want to see if there's more you might be able to say about what Harriet Tubman might say to us in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thank you for that question. The strongest message that I think Harriet Tubman had to offer the people she was with was that they needed to trust and believe that God would deliver them. That's what she said again and again. That's what she said in the woods and on the roads. And oftentimes she would sing it. She would sing about angels being present when people were terrified that they were going to be captured and taken back into slavery. So if Tubman were here today, seeing what we are seeing, I do think she would tell us to trust, which is such a difficult thing to do. I don't know if I can do it, but I can tell you that she did. She did. We have so many stories about Harriet Tubman's actions on the Underground Railroad when she was doing things that made no sense to anybody around her. She was taking grave risks. She was taking actions that were harmful to her own health.
Could you share some of those?
Yes.
Please.
Yes, absolutely. In one example that we have, a powerful story of Harriet Tubman, actually that appeared in the movie about Harriet Tubman, the biography that Cassie Lemons directed. We see her coming up to a rushing waterway, which is described as a river in the primary sources and also as a very deep creek in the primary sources. And Tubman would get, she'd get information. She'd get pieces of knowledge when she was out with people trying to help them escape. It would come to her in her own mind, and she understood this to be information from God, and she would listen. So in this moment, when she and her party, the people with her, knew that hunters were on their trail, she didn't know what she would do until she paused and allowed a message to come to her. And that message was to go into the water, which seemed incredibly dangerous because people thought that they were going to drown in this rushing waterway, which would have been very cold because she often moved in the winter because she liked to make her escapes when she thought more people would be indoors rather than outdoors. And so she went in, and they made it through, and they did escape their pursuers. But she paid a high cost for that, Reverend Lamar, a very high cost. She ended up getting ill, and even though she was ill, she took the group in her party to the home, the very modest home of a free black family who didn't have anything themselves, but were willing to take Harriet Tubman and the people who were fleeing with her in. And because she always wanted to reciprocate and to give to people who were generous to her, she took off her underclothing and gave it to this poor family, even though she was cold from the weather, even though she was in pain, even though she needed that clothing. She gave it to them as a token of her thanks.
I want to get to the questions of those who read the book, but you gesture toward the fact that for us to be free today and to free ourselves, we must depend on knowledge different than the knowledge that we currently depend on. It requires, and I hate to use the nerdy terms, I'm trying to avoid it, but I will not any longer. It requires an epistemological shift, being willing to know differently. So you say that she would stand and wait for a message, and when she heard the message, it was dangerous, but people were saved. People got ownership. It's ludicrous, as absolutely evil and preposterous as it is and it sounds. They got possession of their own body because she waited for knowledge that was not scientific, not to be found in books. And I really think, especially for those of us in spiritual community, religious community, we do not believe in the power of that kind of knowing.
Right.
Can you say just a little more?
I love that question. I love that question because I struggled with this in working on this book about Harriet Tubman. I struggled with how there could be all these stories of things happening that did not make sense. It did not make sense that all of a sudden she would take people she was with into a swamp when there was no way out, and then all of a sudden a nice Quaker gentleman came by with a wagon to help them. It didn't make sense that she would show up at the doorsteps of fellow abolitionists and say, I'm here for the money that you've collected for me so that I can help the people that I'm with. And they would say, we don't have any money. And then they'd say, wait, hold on a second. And the money would just appear. Somebody would come to the door with the money right then. This happened so many times. And I was struggling reading the sources to figure out, okay, I need something else to help me to understand about the money. Like, how did she know it was there? Like, did somebody else mention to her that it was there? I never could find a way to kind of puncture the mystery of what she did. And so I'm sitting here before you just saying, I don't know how she came to understand what she understood. I can only tell you that she said it was from God. I can only tell you that she never lost a single person that she was trying to help free. So she did listen to a source that I think some of us know how to listen to, but it's muted. It's muted in our present time. There's so much other noise, and we can't hear. We have to, I believe, open those channels again. We have to open those channels. We have to listen. And if you allow me to just add one more component onto this, Reverend, at the same time that Tubman listened to God, said she listened to God, reacted in response to what God told her, and never seemed to question it, even if it was illogical, she was also a brilliant woman. And I did not know this before I started my research. This is something that I feel a little bit embarrassed about. That when I started researching Harriet Tubman, I had a picture of her in my mind that maybe some of us in this space also have had, of a woman who, she knew how to act, but that doesn't mean that she was a particularly astute thinker. But she was actually both. And so when Tubman said she was hearing from God, I'm going to take her at her word that she felt she was hearing from God. But I can also see, when I look at the context, that she was observing her environment. She was reading people around her. She was interpreting all the social and political dynamics. She understood economics. Okay, one story. When Harriet Tubman freed herself for the very first time, she had a quilt that she had made that she traded to a white woman in the area in exchange for information. This was a woman who knew about the logics of exchange, right? That she had to have something of value to get something of value. So she traded that quilt that she had made for information about a safe house that she could go to. So God, yes. And also a sharp, perceptive sense of who was around her and what they were about and what she needed to do to navigate in hostile environments.
And I thank you for keeping those things in tension, because I think you're right. They feed one another, because what we do not want her to become is a sort of magical Negro from the trope, someone without the textures and the thickness of all the ways that we're human.
Yes.
Thank you. It's what we need to hear. So from Evelyn at New York Avenue, how did Tubman's resilience, abiding faith in God, and connections with others, including other African American women of the time, provide us with lessons to navigate a just path forward today while faced with so many difficulties?
Well, thank you for that question, Evelyn. I don't see you exactly right now, but I wish I did. This is such an important point, that Tubman didn't act alone. Now, I said this earlier when I was speaking from the pulpit. A little bit of an unusual place for me to find myself. That she always felt that God was with her. Yes, all right, we take that at face value, I think, to respect her. But she also didn't act without human companionship. She was regularly in conversation with other people, under the care of other people, and caring for other people. One of the most beautiful things about Tubman's life when she was a little Minty Ross is that when she was exploited and abused as a child who was made to do forced labor that was breaking her body down, she would be sent back by the people who were leasing her. She would be sent back to her owner because she wasn't worth it to them anymore because she couldn't do the work. When she was returned to her owner, she ended up being under the care of her mother because her mother was often on his property. And it was her mother, Harriet Green, or Rit Green, who, through her love and her nurturing and certainly her knowledge of botanical healing practices, brought Minty back to health again and again and again. So we wouldn't have had a Harriet Tubman if we had not had a Harriet Green. She needed the nurturing love and care and the courage of her mother. And her mother was so courageous, you all. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what her mother did. And Harriet Tubman throughout her life practiced that same way of being with other people in family and in community. She took care of others, and that became her lifelong mission after she was free, to create a community where people who were in need, people who were elderly, people who were mothers with children and struggling to take care of them alone, people who were hungry, people with disabilities could come and live. And we have to remember that when Tubman was doing all these things, being a caregiver, being a caretaker, inviting people to come and live with her, she was poor. She was poor, and she was still relying on God. Some of the women who write about Tubman in the biographies that I mentioned earlier from her time, people who knew her, were always astonished and astounded that Tubman was still taking in more people. And they would describe Tubman as somebody who was irrational. They would talk about her in a way that suggested that it made no sense that she would bring in, another sick mother who was blind with their 5 children when she's got no food and no money. But what they didn't seem to realize was Tubman was never alone. And in fact, they were part of her care circle. They were some of the ones who were bringing the money and bringing the food and helping her to realize her vision, even as they seemed to have missed what it was that she was about and what it was that she was capable of.
One of the extraordinary things is that she was a spy,
Yes.
soldier. She
Yes.
did all kinds of incredible things. But the image I have in my mind is of the photograph I know that when she was elderly. She's sitting in a chair covered in a blanket that appears to be white.
Mm-hmm.
She just, tell me what that image, if you all have not seen that image, if you Google Harriet Tubman images, do that now if you've never seen that. But I want to ask you what you, after learning and reading, what did you see in that image? That's
Well, this is an iconic image, and I think that a positive notion we can take from it is that Tubman did live to be a very old, very wise woman. She was someone who was settled and clear in herself, and to my mind, that picture shows it. She seems like someone who is very self-possessed and who has a certain kind of knowledge that goes beyond what we can know on this earth. Because she was quite elderly and she was, close to her death in that picture. But what we don't see in that picture so much is the fact that she's being photographed on land that she owned, in front of a home that she had built to take care of elderly black people. So she, in her last years of life, was living in a home that she had built for community care. So she benefited from her own generosity to other people. And we also don't see the very long middle years of her life. I mean, I do think, Reverend, that we clip Tubman's biography off at the ends. That we see her as somebody who was an Underground Railroad, conductor or activist, and she was. Or we see someone who is this serene elderly woman who is, perhaps seeming passive or still in this photograph that you're describing. And by that time in her life, she was slowing down and she was depending upon the care of others. But she lived a very long time. From around 1822, we're not 100% sure of that birth date, to 1913. And there are decades and decades in the middle. And during that time in the middle, she was, as you said, a spy. She was an unrecognized commander of a Civil War action. That's the one that freed over 700 people. And for more on that, you all, look for the book titled Combahee by the historian Etta Fields Black. She goes into great detail about the Combahee or Combahee River raid in June of 1863 in the Civil War. She was taking care of a family, and she was expanding and she was growing her family. So much that many of the people in Auburn, New York, where Tubman settled in her middle years, referred to her as aunt. And I don't mean in that stereotypical way that we know of from the South. I mean, there were black people in the community who all called her aunt. And many of them didn't really know if they were her blood aunt or if they were her love aunt, through adopted kin, because she took in so many people. There's an incredible interview, which is an oral history interview of a descendant of Tubman's that was done by the Maryland State Parks. And in this interview, which I quote from a night flyer, the woman who is talking about her relationship to Tubman says that for her whole life, she didn't know that she was blood related to Tubman. She just thought she was Aunt Harriet because everybody called her Aunt Harriet. And she then later found out, oh my goodness, I'm related to her through blood. So there were many, many decades of her life between Underground Railroad and kind of sage elderly woman with the white cloth over her head. And I think that can give us inspiration in recognizing that there are going to be changes, right? There are going to be some periods of our lives that are the Underground Railroad years when we need to be out there in the woods physically rescuing people. There are going to be some phases when we've got to be the strategists and the spies because things have come to a head and there is a full-on war taking place. There are going to be phases when we need to build community and acquire land and learn how to feed people. There are going to be phases when we need to extend the family circle, bring people in. And there are going to be phases when we will be the ancestors who can be the models for people in the future.
I appreciated your naming her as an economic thinker because thankfully she failed at American extractive capitalism and shows us a model of mutual aid that is relevant in the moment. So, interesting, I want to set up Jim's question with, there is something that black people say about reading, and it's not about texts. They talk about getting read, someone reading you, which literally speaks to multiple literacies. And I've often thought about there are literacies greater than reading and writing. Some African cultures despise the writing because they thought that it would take the mystery out of human communication. But Jim says here that Harriet Tubman was obviously highly intelligent, yet never learned to read or write. And you mentioned in the book that she had interest in it, but never was able to devote time to it. What is your understanding of why she never learned that kind of literacy?
first I want to go to your point about multiple kinds of literacy, because she certainly possessed them. One of the literacy she possessed was landscape literacy. That is, she could read the land and the natural world around her, and she did it all the time, from a very small age. From the time when she ran away as a little girl who had been leased out from these temporary, quote, masters, as she calls them, who were attempting to physically punish her, and found a pig pen and lived with a mother pig and some baby piglets for 4 days when she was a small girl who was around the age of a first grader.
So she lived with a mother pig and piglets.
Yes, she calls her the old sow. Yes, and the piglets for days. So she could read the landscape. She could make decisions about what the landscape was telling her and where she could go, where she could find safe haven, where she could hide. And she could also read people. And this is probably her most powerful form of literacy. There's a story that immediately comes to mind that I think is just so sharp about Harriet Tubman. There are many like this, but she was doing one of her missions, going back to Maryland, trying to free people. And she recognized somebody who she referred to as one of her old masters. Now, she used that language in the plural because she had been rented out and loaned out and leased out to so many people that she had many whom she had been compelled to refer to as master when she was young. So on this rescue mission, she saw one of her old masters, and she was actually on a train. So much of that does not take place on trains, but this moment does take place on a train. And she had to think fast because there was a bounty on her head. And what did she do? She picked up a newspaper and opened it, because she knew that this old master would know that the Harriet Tubman who was being hunted could not read. That was her only disguise, you all, is to recognize what he would have been thinking about, how he would have interpreted his world, how he would have seen a black woman, and just flipped it upside down. He's looking for somebody who can't read. Oh.
Extraordinary.
And I forgot the question, which was, why didn't she learn to read in her life? We don't know this directly from her. She does not say why she didn't learn. She only says that she wanted to learn. My interpretation of this is that I think she just had other priorities. She had a lot to do between the Underground Railroad, Civil War, saving people, feeding people, building a community. And learning how to read and write does take time. It takes the consistency of returning to the written page. And I don't know that she was willing to devote that time. So she dictated her letters. She dictated various descriptions of her life, which became her early biographies. She relied on photographs to help her to identify people who she thought were going to be friends or people who were going to be foes. And it worked for her.
Thank you. From Lynn, New York Avenue, I thought the most interesting part of the book was the way you intertwined your discussion of Tubman's life with the stories of Old Elizabeth, Jarena Lee, Zilpha Elaw, Julia Foote, those who were referred to as Sisters of the Spirit. I'm curious if you have any evidence that Tubman may have been aware of these women and their religious beliefs or others like them, or was her own faith journey completely independent of other prominent black female spiritual teachers?
So nothing she did was independent, though she was her own person, and she was certainly a unique person, as every single one of us is. Tubman always learned from teachers, and I would venture to guess that one of her most important female spiritual teachers was her mother, because Tubman's mother and Tubman's father, they were both very religious, and Tubman grew up going to a Methodist church with them for a little bit of the time when she was a child. So I think that she would have taken in these spiritual lessons. I don't think that she just was placed in the home of people who were leasing her or renting her and just learned how to pray completely on her own. I think she had been taught these things by her parents and probably by her mother among them. So no, she was not independent. Do we know whether or not she came into contact with any of the women preachers, the black women preachers who I talk about in the book? Well, we can't know for certain, but one of them, Zilpha Elah, did come to the area where Tubman was enslaved and did give a sermon. She did preach there. So it is possible. I tried to ground this discussion of these other sisters, these other black women spiritual leaders, in a description and an understanding of a black faith which was shared among enslaved people. It was also shared among free people, but the focus in Tubman's early life has to do with what it was like to be enslaved and to grow up as a chattel child. This faith that enslaved people had was powerful, it had deep roots, and it was widely shared. And so I can't even imagine a way that an enslaved child could come up and come of age and have a religious faith that was not influenced by other people around them.
If you'll pardon the alliteration, it is chilling to hear you say a chattel child. And I just think it's chilling.
It is.
And it's chilling. So you didn't have many of the advantages that authors generally have when they write biographies, such as things written, and the ways you compensate for that are very creative. However, since you didn't have some of those advantages biographers usually have, are there areas of richness in Tubman's life that you felt you couldn't bring to life? And I'm thinking, would you say that you were doing what Tiya Hartman would call critical fabulation here?
Not precisely. So Tiya Hartman, who is a wonderful scholar with incredibly mind-opening ideas, talks about critical fabulation, that is narrative invention based on what we know from the sources, as a method for how we can come closer to understanding the lives of people, especially black women, who didn't have traditional sources that were written about them or kept about them. I have used that method in other work, but in this work, I was not moving firmly into the space of imagining. I think the closest I get to that is the storm, but this storm moment is based on evidence that we have where we know that Harriet Tubman did last, through a storm in Maryland, an unexpected kind of cold flash that was very dangerous. There are places in her life and in her biography that I could not get close to, that I wanted to get close to, that I had to just accept were not going to be an expansive part of the book. Most importantly, I think, there was the specificity of her religious life, kind of the mystery that I referred to earlier, that I can write around, but that I can't get into because I cannot get into her mind. I mean, I wish I could have heard what she heard or seen some of her visions, but we don't have that ability. We just have to go with the sources that we have. So I don't fully know, I can't fully replicate or reconstruct what it was like when Tubman had one of her visions, which were so powerful for her and which also gave her information. Another very important space in her life that I could not enter was the one that she shared with her husband, her first husband, John Tubman. This is a difficult one because certainly this relationship would have been very important to her. This was the husband of her youth. He was a free man. We would have to wonder why a free black man would marry an enslaved black woman, knowing that his children would be enslaved. Some scholars have speculated that he really must have loved her to be willing to risk his children's freedom by being with her. We know that Harriet Tubman attempted to return to bring John Tubman out of Maryland. He was free, but she wanted to be there to help to guide him and lead him north. And she even brought him a new suit of clothes, which I think of when I look at your beautiful jacket.
Thank you.
Yes, she brought him a new suit of clothes, but when she returned for him, she found that he had married another woman who was free. What would that have done to her inside? She had risked recapture, which meant she had risked her life to go back into slave territory, to join with her husband again, to bring him up north with her. That suggests that she loved him in a very intense way. And I can't access that. I can't access that. And let me tell you all something. I don't think she wanted us to access that, because in the interview material that we have from the time that she lived, we have lots of details about her life. And about her husband, we have just about 2 sentences, which are very brief. Very, very brief. And what we know are basically the things that I just told you. She got the new suit. She went down. He was married to another woman.
It's extraordinarily painful.
It is. It's painful what slavery tried to do to relationships and to families and to love. This is what slavery tried to do. It did not succeed, because Harriet Tubman still opened her heart. And so did her husband, apparently, because he married again. People did make new families. They did go on. But one of the deepest evils of this system was precisely that. The ripping apart of families, the forcing people to have to make terrible choices between their freedom and their loved ones, which we see again and again and again.
It seems appropriate here to ask about what scholars and others are calling the afterlives, plural, of slavery. Could you just say whatever you wish about the afterlives of slavery?
I mean, these are the legacies of hundreds of years of chattel slavery that we still live with. You know, I know you all know this here in the sanctuary, and you all also know it if you're joining us online. Slavery was not that long ago. I was talking with a woman, a member of this church, before this event began, and she was telling me about her enslaved ancestors, information that she knows, that her mother has written down, that was passed down in the family. These are memories that are just a few generations behind our elders. So it's very close, which I think means we shouldn't be surprised that there are going to be after effects. If I take a pebble and throw it into the water, you're going to see those ripples. That's what the afterlives are. They are the psychological baggage and trauma. They are the economic setbacks. They are some of the fractures and fissures in relationships. They are even the ways in which descendants of enslaved people are positioned on the landscape. And we haven't found a way to untangle these threads of enslavement. We have not found a way. And unfortunately, I feel that we're going in the wrong direction.
Since you say that, regrettably, this is from Martha at New York Avenue. Regrettably, we have heard recent stories of states that are banning books on slavery and other ugly parts of American history by saying it makes white people feel bad or guilty. There was one episode I heard of recently where a poster of Harriet Tubman was removed to comply with the anti-DEI focus. Has Nightfly run into any problems or been banned by anyone to your knowledge? And would you please comment in general on how the resistance seems to be growing to efforts to teach the truth about our nation's painful history on race?
it's a mess. It is a mess that we're living in right now, and I fear that it is only going to get worse, which is why I'm so grateful to models like Harriet Tubman, because she lived in times that I can't even fully imagine. And she suffered through things that many of us could not bear. And yet she kept on going. I have not heard of Night Flyer being banned anywhere. I hope this doesn't give people out there ideas about what should happen with the book. But obviously, these tactics are dangerous. And they look a lot to me like the kinds of laws that were in place that were meant to keep enslaved people from learning how to read and write. Because knowledge is dangerous. The part about the guilt that people might feel is one that really bothers me. I've heard this before in other contexts as well, the concern that some people might feel that they need to protect white people, especially white children, from feeling guilty. One thing that I strongly feel about that is none of us can control somebody else's emotions, and I don't think that we should be in the business of trying to control people's emotions. There could be plenty of white children out there who would hear about this history and instead feel energized and feel convicted and feel a sense of purpose to be on the side of right. There are plenty of people in Night Flyer and in abolitionist history writ large who, despite their white racial categorization, or even maybe their white racial identity, decided that slavery was a moral wrong that they were going to fight against, because they thought that this is what God would want from them. There are whole other ways to read this history. I would actually have to ask, I'd have to wonder, if you come up with the idea that this history would make you feel guilty, what is that saying about you?
Wow. From Marion at Metropolitan, could you talk a little bit about the subtitle of the book, Harriet Tubman and the Faith Dreams of a Free People? Why did you choose that?
This was an assemblage of words that just came to me. They just came. And I wasn't even sure at first if they made sense. Are you laughing, huh? He was over there laughing. Maybe they don't make sense, I don't know. They came to me almost as if in a dream. They seemed to want to go together. Now, after I had them, I could figure out a logic behind them. But I'm telling you, they did not arise out of logic. I actually thought that my editor would not let me keep them, because you kind of got to wonder, what's a faith dream? And what do you mean a free people? Because these are all enslaved people that we're talking about. But here's the logic behind it that I came to see after the words came. Faith dreams is a combination of two really important portals in Tubman's life. One is her faith that we talked about, and another is the dreams that she had. She was a dreamer from the time that she was a girl, and many of her dreams were actually quite frightening. She had recurring nightmares about white men on horses coming to take her away, which were in part influenced by a traumatic experience she had of seeing two of her sisters sold. But she also had dreams which seemed to be visionary, dreams where she would imagine a bird flying over a landscape. There's that landscape literacy again, where she would imagine herself as the bird flying over a landscape. And this landscape was divided between slave territory, which she viewed as hell, and free territory, which she viewed as heaven. She had this dream again and again of trying to traverse this landscape and of falling right before she made it across the line. Until one day, she brought this dream into realization. She did it, right? She did it on foot, on the ground, and she made it across the line. So dreaming was an important part of how she processed information, how she interpreted the world around her, and how she gained courage to listen to the voice of God that she was hearing. So the faith dreams were Tubman's dreams, which were in part fueled by her faith, but they were also the dreams of Black enslaved people writ large who shared a faith in the God of deliverance, in a God who would see them through, a God of the Old Testament. And the free people portion of the subtitle has to do with the fact that whether or not you pay a price for them, whether or not you buy or sell them or put them in chains, you cannot take away the God-given freedom of any human being. You cannot take away freedom. It's not yours to take. It wasn't given by you. It wasn't given by a person. Tubman believed this. She believed that God was on the side of freedom and that God would defend her as she fought for freedom. So through that way of thinking, enslaved people were actually always a free people. And here's another small aspect of that part of the subtitle. We're talking about Harriet Tubman being entrepreneurial and having a strong economic sense. She also had a strong legal mind, you all. That even before she was free, she was able to get a little bit of money because she negotiated with her owner to be able to lease out her own time. So she had to give him most of the money, but she could keep a little bit of the money. What did she do with that money? She purchased a pair of oxen to help her make more productive use of her work time, so she could earn more money, right, that she could keep a little bit of. And she hired an attorney. Yes, Harriet Tubman, as an enslaved young woman, hired a lawyer. I have to say right now, thank heavens for the lawyers in the courts, but she hired a lawyer because she always thought something was fishy about her mother's enslavement. This is, again, the literacy of reading people. Something did not sit right with her. She thought something was wrong with her mother still being enslaved. She had an attorney look into it, and he found that, yes, indeed, something was wrong, because her mother should have been freed soon after the death of the father of the man who was their current owner. So their current owner had inherited them from his father. There had been a portion of the will that said that after a certain number of years, Harriet Tubman's mother should have been free. If that had happened, Tubman would have still been enslaved because of the time, but the youngest children would have been born free. So to me, this notion that part of Harriet Tubman's family was actually always free legally, or they should have been, it stuck with me. And I was thinking, these were a free people in all the ways that you can define a free people.
When you say the words came to you, I was taken back to Tubman listening. Did this book happen differently than your other work?
This book and the book about enslaved women that I wrote before it, All That She Carried, which is about an antique cotton sack, they were akin. They were like each other. And they both had that quality to them that you're describing, Reverend. And they were different from other books that I have written. These were books in which I didn't feel alone while I was writing. They were books in which ideas would come and I couldn't trace them back. I don't know why Night Flyer starts with the storm, it just does. Because one day I just knew it starts with the storm. And when I knew that it started with the storm, I also knew that I wasn't only talking about that storm in Harriet Tubman's moment, because I was talking about coming storms. I felt a sense of companionship in writing this book and in writing all that she carried. And I will say, I'm not claiming, I don't even think it was Harriet Tubman's companionship. I write in the book about how she was an elusive person. There's a reason why we don't know very much about her, I think. I think she was protecting her secrets. I think that she wanted to keep, for example, that early marriage close to her heart. She wanted some privacy, and I can respect that. So I am not saying that I think Harriet Tubman in some way was a part of this, but I do think, and I had the feeling, the experience of a community feeding into this work. And I'm not going to say whether the community is living people or ancestors. You can fill in the blanks for yourself as you hear me share this. But I wasn't alone.
Before I ask the last question, I just want to share with those here and those online and with you that one of my teachers, Mama E.T. Harriet, we're doing work on ancestral memory, sacred memory, and she says that this place is an ancestral shrine. And so you see these two candelabra. One was given to the church by Frederick Douglass himself. The other was given by women in the church, a group of strong women. At this very altar, the remains of A. Philip Randolph, the greatest American socialist from whom we need to learn in this moment to do the work of anti-capitalism and justice that ought to be at the root of the ministries of every church in America. Rosa Parks, Frances Cress Welsing. Here in the wings in the balcony, you see two African deities, because one of the things that we want to be clear about in Metropolitan is that the Christian faith has been wrong when it rooted out indigeneity and told people they were evil, they were wrong, they were pagans. And it's very interesting that in white Christianity absorbed Celtic Christianity. But it says to us, we cannot absorb our own ancestral stuff. So to them I say, later for you, we do what we do. And this final question from Celeste Bryant, as we center that ancestral component of all of our faith, what would Harriet Tubman say to us, black people in particular, who say we don't have time to fight for change and don't even know where to start?
I don't get the sense from the sources we have about Tubman that she would have said something directly that would have been received as judgmental or critical. I bet she would have had a song that she offered that was meant to encourage people and to inspire people and to compel them through support to carry on. But I think through her example, the example of her life, that we can see how she would approach such a problem of being busy, of being tired. And the way she approached it was to keep on pushing through. One of the things that I struggled with in the book, as well, was the lack of balance between care for others and care for self that Tubman exhibited. She put herself in harm's way. She ran herself to the ground. She was a teenager and then a woman with a serious, recurring, chronic illness She had what scholars today think was temporal lobe epilepsy. She had seizures frequently. She had terrible, crushing, extremely painful headaches when she was out there in the woods, like the time when she was going through the river or the deep creek and came out sick. She had a terrible toothache. She was just often in poor health. And yet she just kept pushing on through. A part of me wishes that she had been able to take some time away to care for herself. But a part of me is glad that she showed us what can be possible, even if you are sick, even if you are pain, even if you have a disability, even if you are tired, even if you are poor. She showed us through her example that it's possible, which I think is much more powerful than saying it's possible.
What's your name here working the camera, brother? So I'm just paying attention to Aaron because he's an artist. I mean, what they do to frame this stuff is art. And the way that your words are landing on Aaron, I'm watching your body move. I'm thinking of his line from Mos Def, one of the greatest poets, also hip-hop lyricist. He said his music is so good that the sound man stage dives, right? So this is so good that the cameraman is just like, doesn't know what to do. Would you join me in thanking Professor Miles? And Theo, we welcome you back. Thank you very much. We stand to applaud you. Outstanding. Outstanding. And we can stay here, but thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. I look forward already to going back and watching it, recording of it. Just so rich and so much there. We're close to time here. Just a couple of quick announcements. And then I want to invite Dr. Miles, if she has a final quick word, and then invite Reverend Lamar to offer a benediction. But very quickly, I just want to urge all of you to think about ways you can build on this program and others like it. The first thing I would suggest you do, if you haven't, is to get and read Night Flyer. We in fact have some copies of it available at the reception. If you want to get some, we have limited copies, but it's available online. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, very readable. I encourage you to read it with some friends or maybe at your church. In addition, there are other books by Dr. Miles, and there are 4 that we're highlighting and showing here in terms of the availability to some to think about. There are others. I'd recommend you just Google her and read about some of her writings, but she's written fascinating array. We're mentioning here 4. Wild Girls, How the Outdoors Shaped the Women Who Changed a Nation. All That She Carried, we spoke about that earlier. The Dawn of Detroit, a wonderful story about some history in Detroit and its relationship to slavery. And Ties That Bind, story of an Afro-Cherokee family. Fascinating historical work that she does, and we recommend you explore that in addition to Night Flyer. Finally, just to encourage you to make some effort, not just during Black History Month, but in general, to learn about some of the heroes we're talking about tonight and others. And there are so many opportunities now online. We in Washington can do things directly, but so much of what we can access and learn is online. So all around the country, I encourage you to make a decision to choose something, some way you can learn more about the great heroes of the past, like Harriet Tubman. One final thing, just to tell you, the next McClendon Scholar Program, and we'll be sending information on this, will feature Amanda Tyler. She is the director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty, and she is one of the leaders nationally against the Christian nationalist movement. She's written a book and leads a movement warning people about the dangers of Christian nationalism. She'll be speaking. We don't have the exact date. It'll be late March or early April, and we'll send you information on that. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you, Dr. Miles and Reverend Lamar, and I just invite a final word, if you'd like, and then Reverend Lamar to close us.
Okay, yes, thank you. Two final words. One is that Harriet Tubman lived through tumultuous times. To survive those times, she had to accept change. She had to keep her eyes open and be aware and to recognize when meaningful changes were taking place. So she couldn't bury her head in the sand. At the same time that she accepted change, she also instigated change. So she saw things changing around her, she recognized it, she considered it, she thought about it, and then she went out and she acted to make her own change. I think that is an incredibly powerful model for us. And I have one more, which is Harriet Tubman chose to move in the most difficult times and contexts. She chose to try to free people in the winter and at night, because those hard periods of the year and periods of the day, those times when people were frightened to go out or needed to be kept at home warm and cozy, were the best times for her to achieve her ends. So she worked in the cold. She worked in the dark. She worked through the bleakness. And while she did, she constantly looked up for the stars, which she also describes as the heavens. So even though she moved through darkness and chose to do so because that was going to be the most effective tactic, she found the light on her path, which was her God. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank you, beautiful human beings, for being here tonight. I pray that you have been stirred and nourished for the work we must do in the dead of winter. And in nights, as James Weldon Johnson would say, blacker than 1,000 midnights in a cypress swamp, we must still do the work before us. And so I leave you with a poem. One of the poets I know because my wife is smarter than I am and I listen to her, Lucille Clifton, one that continues to resonate with me. This poem is entitled, "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Go in peace.